We are moving into the second half of the book of Genesis today. So it's a long book with 50 chapters. We're going to start today in chapter 25 at the halfway point. So go ahead and turn over to the midpoint in our book of Genesis this morning.
Got 3 more weeks?
I know. We got a lot to cover in 3 weeks. We're going to focus our time for the remainder of this quarter looking at the life of really 2 main characters, Jacob and then one of his 12 sons, Joseph, and then the events surrounding their families and their lives. So as we know from looking at this book as a whole, the first part of Genesis goes through events, sort of ancient events with creation, the flood, and so forth. But really the bulk of Genesis is devoted to really the family line of Abraham, beginning with Abraham and then Isaac, which we talked about last week, and then carried on through Jacob, and then through Jacob's sons, as we'll go through the next few weeks. And again, the reason the focus here in Genesis is on this family line is because this is the family line that would give rise to the Israelites, who were God's chosen people. And God chose Abraham and his lineage, his family, to, number one, be his chosen people. And God made a group of promises or covenants with this family. They were played out with regard to the Israelites specifically, and then eventually on through Jesus. And through him, all nations of the earth, including ourselves, have been blessed through the actions and life of Jesus. So Abraham, the promises were made to initially, and then they were given again to his son Isaac. As we're picking up now in chapter 25, Isaac was going to then have 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, and the promises would then be carried out through one of these 2 sons. So we're going to look at Jacob and Esau, focusing on Jacob for our time here today. So I've kind of taken the life of Jacob and put it into 4 general segments, all right? And Jacob is a fun character to study because he's a flawed individual. All right, and just like all of us, we all have flaws. But God, as oftentimes he did, utilized a flawed individual to carry out his purposes. And so the first stage of Jacob's life, we're going to call him Jacob the Deceiver. Because as we know from, back in elementary school studying these stories, Jacob was a deceiver mainly of his brother Esau and also of his father Isaac. And we'll see those today. And then Jacob goes from being the deceiver to being the deceived. And specifically, Jacob was going to be deceived by his father-in-law Laban. And he was tricked into marrying Leah rather than Rachel initially. And so the tables were turned on Jacob, and he went from being the trickster to being the tricked. And then Jacob goes into this period of being the distressed. And we'll see that he was distressed about his reunitement with Esau, and he wasn't sure if Esau was going to attack and be very angry or not. And then he also became very distressed when his favorite son, Joseph, was told to him as being dead. All right? And then for many years, he was distressed because he believed that his favorite son, Joseph, was no more. And eventually, Jacob became the delighted, as we'll see at the very end, when he was reunited with Joseph, and then his family then moved on into Egypt. So keep that in mind as we go through our look at the life of Jacob. Starting here with Jacob the Deceiver. All right, so let's look at Jacob and Esau, a tale of opposites. So these were twin brothers, the sons of Isaac, but they were very, very different in their appearance and also their personalities and their actions. So let's look at chapter 25, beginning here in verse 19. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. So again, much like Sarah, Isaac's mother, his wife Rachel, or his wife Rebekah, lots of names here, was barren for a time. And then finally the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, and this is an important prophecy here, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So even before the actual birth of Jacob and Esau, God made a prophecy to Rebekah that there were 2 separate nations in her womb. The younger would basically rule over the older. All right? Verse 24, when her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak, so they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to Jacob and Esau. All right, so this prophecy that we see here, the one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger, it's going to be played out in many regards throughout the lives of Jacob and Esau. So let's take some time here and contrast the lives and kind of characteristics of these 2 twins. All right, so Jacob and Esau, which one was technically the older of the 2 and therefore should have inherited the larger portion of the inheritance and the blessing of the father?
Esau.
All right, so Esau was the oldest, Jacob was the youngest. So they were twins, but Esau was delivered first. And so by right of the family traditions, the oldest should have received the blessings of the father, the greater part of the inheritance, and we'll see later on that didn't come into fruition. All right, how would you describe the body appearance of Jacob and Esau? That's very well known.
Esau was hairy.
All right, Esau was a hairy man, and apparently he had what color hair?
Red.
All right, so Esau had red hair. He was a hairy man. Jacob, we don't know exactly about his, but he wasn't hairy apparently, and he also didn't have the red hair. What about their personalities? How would you describe the personalities of Jacob and Esau as we see here from Genesis?
Esau liked to hunt, and Jacob liked to stay in the tents.
All right, so Esau was an outdoorsman, right? He was that kind of guy that likes to go out, he likes to hunt, work outside. And if you were to describe Jacob in today's sort of vernacular, what phrase would you use to refer to Jacob? All right, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, he was a mama's boy. That's right. Jacob stayed home. He stayed in the tents, and the Bible says he was a quiet man. All right, so in terms of personality, they were very different. All right, Esau was the outdoorsman. Jacob stayed inside. He was the quiet person. He wasn't this big outdoorsy kind of guy. And these sort of characteristics of their personality kind of then led into favoritism by their parents. And so which one was favored by Isaac and which one by Rebekah? All right, Esau was favored by Isaac and Jacob was favored by Rebekah. And this would lead to problems, and this was a general theme, right? Isaac was preferred by Abraham, Esau was preferred by Isaac, and Jacob by Rebekah. With Jacob's family, he had preferences for Rachel's children, Joseph and Benjamin, over his others. There were preferences for wives, and this favoritism within families led to, all sorts of problems and just arguments and turmoil within these families. And then finally, what about the thoughtfulness? How would you describe the thoughtfulness of Jacob and Esau with regard to their life situation and their inheritance and birthright and all that kind of stuff?
Esau had no disregard for it. He was going to give up his birthright just for something to eat.
Impulsive.
Yeah.
All right, Esau was impulsive. He was somewhat apathetic, it seems, toward his birthright. What about Jacob? How would you describe Jacob? Opportunistic. That's a good description, yeah. I think the word I used was cunning. I like opportunistic even better, probably. Esau thought about short term, right? Like, I'm really hungry right now. This whole birthright thing, I don't care so much about that. I just want my food right now. Whereas Jacob, he took advantage of situations. All right, he was sort of crafty and cunning, and he was opportunistic in how he sort of approached the fact that he was the second child. All right, he used sort of his craftiness to steal what rightfully belonged to Esau. All right, so let's look at these deceits. So the first stage of Jacob's life was he was the deceiver, all right? And this is played out in Genesis in two specific examples. Now, I would guess, if I was a betting man, I would probably say he deceived his family more times than just the two cases we have here in Genesis. All right, but Moses, when he wrote this book, kind of focused on these two specific events because they had very important outcomes. But my guess is Jacob probably took advantage of many situations throughout his life to kind of, help himself get elevated in stature or get what he wanted. But the first one here in chapter 25, beginning in verse 29, Nathan, would you read 29 on through the end of the chapter?
Yes, sir. When Jacob had cooked stew, Esau came in the field from where he's at, and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please let me have a swallow of that red stuff there, for I am famished." Therefore his name is called Edom. But Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." And Esau said, "Behold, I'm about to die, so of what use then is the birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "First swear to me." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and stew, and he ate and drank, and rose and went on his way. Then Esau despised his birthright.
All right, so Esau is out working, hunting, and he comes back in. He's really hungry. Jacob, being the homebody that he is, he's got some food cooked on the stove, all right? And Esau says, "I'm famished. I need food. Give me some of your food." And Jacob says, "Sure. There's going to be a price attached to this, though. All right? How many of you have kids that have done something similar to this? Where one kid wants or needs something really bad, and the other one says, "Sure, I'll give you some of this. I'll share whatever, but I'm going to need something in return."
Okay.
Mackenzie, your house?
Yes.
You can
Sure.
guess which one.
Yeah.
I could guess. So Jacob is taking advantage of Esau in this situation. The thing about this birthright, being the firstborn son, Esau was by tradition to receive the birthright. And so what constituted the birthright? What did that actually entail? Well, there were several things that were sort of by tradition handed down to the oldest son. In terms of the physical inheritance, the oldest would receive a double portion of the inheritance. The oldest would also receive the blessing from his father, which would be, we'll see that story coming up next. The oldest also became the head of the family once that patriarch had passed away. And so as head of the family, the oldest, which should have been Esau, would have had authority over the family, been able to make decisions regarding the family, would have had responsibility for the family members, for any widowed wives, any sisters that were unmarried. He would have had responsibility to take care of the family, essentially. But for this family specifically, there was another really important part of this birthright, and that was this covenant relationship with God. Because God chose Abraham and his family to make this covenant with, those patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and then what would have been Isaac's oldest son, would have been in that close relationship with God. And we know that God spoke to the patriarchs. He made promises and covenants with these patriarchs. And most likely that was well known to Jacob and Esau, right? They would have known about Abraham, about Isaac, about the promises God had made to them, about the history of moving their family to the land of Canaan, the promises of that land to them. So all of that would have been passed on to Esau as being the oldest son, but Esau was, as Mindy said, apathetic, dismissive toward that birthright. So that there's obviously a physical aspect to that in which he gave up, part of his inheritance. He gave up that leadership role in his family, but he's also giving up in doing so that covenant relationship that God would have with the head of the family. That would have been passed on, you would expect, from Isaac to Esau as being the oldest. But as we'll see, God does not make his promises to Esau. He makes his promises to Jacob. And so Esau gave up all of that. That was a lot to give up just for a bowl of stew. So there's much more going on here than just the physical and the family, but also that spiritual aspect that he's giving up and handing over to his younger brother Jacob. If you look over in Hebrews chapter 12, we have, I think, maybe time to read this here. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 16 through 17. If someone gets there, would you read it out for us?
That no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears.
All right, so he's referred to in Hebrews as being unholy because of his giving away, his rejection of his birthright. So then moving on now to the second deceit of Jacob. So flip over to chapter 27, and we'll spend some time looking at this story here. So Isaac at this point in time is 137 years old, right? He's an old man. He knows that his death is approaching, and so he says it's time to give his blessing to his oldest son. His eyesight's fading, so he can't see very well. And Jacob and Rebekah are going to utilize this to their advantage. So chapter 27, beginning in verse 1. When Isaac was old, his eyes were dim, he could not see. He called Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son." And he answered, "Here I am. Behold, I am old, I do not know the day of my death. Now then take your weapons, your quiver, your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me delicious food, such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die." So he calls Esau in. He says, "Esau, it's time. It's time for me to give you my blessing. But I want you to go out and make some of the food that I love so much, and then bring it into me, and then I will give into you my blessing." At this time, Esau and Jacob are 77 years old. And I don't think that hit me until I was really reading through this, preparing for this. You think about, okay, they're still young men, maybe 20s, when Jacob tricks his father. That's not the case. Jacob is 77 years old when he decides, with his mother's, urging, to trick his father into this. So probably they were young men when the whole birthright took place. But here, he's a pretty old man at 77, and he's still going to deceive his father. So chapter 27, verse 5. Rebekah, she heard what was going on. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "I heard your father speak to your brother Esau. Bring me game, prepare for me delicious food." Let's see. Verse 8. "Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats, so that I may prepare them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies." But Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, "My brother Esau is a hairy man, I'm a smooth man. My father, he might feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him and bring a curse to me instead of a blessing." His mother said to him, "Let your curse be on me, my son, obey my voice." So Jacob goes out and he gets goat from the flock. He doesn't go hunt game like Esau was charged to do. Rebekah prepares the food. She takes the outer skin and hair of the goat and puts it upon Jacob so that he'll seem hairy. Esau must have been a pretty hairy guy for all this to really work out. And then Jacob carries that food into his father. All right, so pick up now at verse 18. "So he went in to his father and said, 'My father.' And he said, 'Here I am.' 'Who are you, my son?' Jacob said, 'I'm Esau, your firstborn.' First lie. 'I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me.' But Isaac said to his son, 'How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?' He answered, 'Because the Lord your God granted me success.'" Wow. Second lie, and now he's pulling God into his lie. "Then Isaac said to Jacob, 'Come near, so I can feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau.' Jacob went near to Isaac his father, who felt him and said, 'The voice is Jacob's, but the hands are the hands of Esau.' He did not recognize him because his hands were hairy, like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him, and he said, "Are you really my son Esau?" And he said, "I am." Third lie. Then he said, "Bring it near to me that I may eat of my son's game and bless you." All right, so he brought the food in. Isaac ate, and then from 26 on through 29, Isaac makes his blessing to Jacob, the blessing that should have gone to the firstborn Esau. All right, so Isaac blesses Jacob and gives that firstborn son blessing to the secondborn. And then, starting down in verse 30, as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, Esau his brother came in from his hunting. He had also prepared food. He said to his father, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me." Verse 32, his father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?" And he answered, "I am your son, your firstborn Esau." Then Isaac trembled very violently and said, "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? And I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him. Yes, and he shall be blessed." There's verse 34. As soon as Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and begged his father, basically, to give him also a blessing. And then Esau says in verse 36, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me these 2 times. He took my birthright, and now he's taking my blessing." The name Jacob means deceiver. All right? And based off of the prophecy that God had made to Rebekah, and then for whatever other reasons, they named Jacob the deceiver. That's what his name meant. And he lived up to that title through deceiving his brother and his father these 2 times, and probably through other actions as well. All right, so what do y'all think? What do you think about this whole story of Rebekah concocting this plan to deceive her own husband so that her favored son would get the blessing of the firstborn?
I find it odd that as a parent, you name your child deceiver from the very beginning.
Yeah.
That's just hard to comprehend for me.
It is a strange way of sort of creating this self-fulfilling prophecy by naming your son the deceiver.
Yeah, and you would think that Rebekah and Isaac had discussed what the Lord had told them about Jacob being the one to receive all this, but yet even Isaac then, if he knew of this, was skirting around what God had said.
Yep.
To still try to give Esau the blessing.
Yeah, so Isaac's blindness, he was physically blind. He really couldn't see, but he was also probably blind to his own family situation and blind to this prophecy that God had made. Because he had to have known the personalities of his sons. He had to have known that Esau was nonchalant or apathetic toward his birthright as being the oldest son. He had to have known that Jacob had stolen this from Esau back years ago. And so, despite knowing all this, he was still trying to funnel that blessing to Esau, his favorite, despite the promise that God had made. So he was even blind inwardly toward all that was going on here. And he was pushing all this toward his favorite son, whereas Rebekah is pushing all towards her favorite son, which led to this, culmination of events we see here. Other thoughts?
She was also helping the Lord out a little bit because he told her that the older shall serve the younger.
Mm-hmm.
So she was trying to make sure that happened.
It's a very optimistic way of looking at it.
It's interesting to think about the difference between gaining the birthright and gaining the blessing. Because, Esau's last statement there is, "Hey, he took my birthright and he took my blessing." As we're reading and I was remembering the story, I was thinking about, it's interesting that it's almost as if Isaac didn't know about that whole exchange between Jacob and Esau. but he may have. It may be a pretty drastic difference between here's the birthright and here's the blessing.
Yeah, it's hard to know for sure. You know, it seems that the blessing was sort of tied up with the birthright. The two were very much linked together. So it's possible Isaac didn't know about what had happened, but in my mind, he probably did know. I mean, many years have gone by, so you would assume this would have come out. But despite knowing that, he still, says, forget that.
Still
I'm
in
giving you
favor.
this blessing.
Yeah.
That's sort of my takeaway. There's speculation in there, but I kind of feel like Isaac probably did know and just sort of disregarded that in terms of the actual blessing itself.
But being the leader of the family, he definitely would have known what God's plan was,
Yes,
which should have been most important.
it should have been, yes.
What's the benefits of getting the blessing for Jacob? I mean, is it
Does it come with something?
yeah.
It's hard to know for sure. There was definitely an honor to that. There was an honor, a status to getting that blessing. Now, if it was miraculous, like if you got the blessing, then there was miraculously, you're going to be, more wealthy or more well-known or whatever. I doubt that. But I think it was more of a family status kind of a deal with you get the blessing, then sort of like the handing of the torch from father to son and getting the firstborn blessing versus blessing, somebody else.
You also get the feeling that it has to do with the patriarchal dispensation,
Mhm.
right? Because, there's prophecy in this passage as it pertains to Esau.
Yes.
So I get the feeling that it's a little bit of a dispensation context where blessings were common at that time.
And what's interesting is this is not an isolated event, right? Because think about this family at large. So who was older, Ishmael or Isaac? Ishmael, but Isaac is the one that got Abraham's blessing and would carry that lineage. Jacob obviously was the younger of the two, and he received the blessing. Who was the oldest of Jacob's sons? Reuben was the oldest, but who was the most well-known of Jacob's sons? Joseph. And which one carried that lineage of Jesus? Judah did. So Reuben, being the oldest, was neither the most powerful of the sons, nor was he the one that carried that lineage of Jesus. That came through Judah instead. And then even, late in the life of Jacob, when he gives his blessing to the sons of Joseph, Joseph has two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh is the older of the two, but when Jacob blesses them, Joseph puts them in front of Jacob, his father. Manasseh on the right, Ephraim on the left. Jacob crosses his arms and gives the greater blessing to Ephraim, the younger of the two. And then Joseph actually brings this up. Father, you're doing this wrong. Manasseh is the older one. He's supposed to get the greater blessing. And Jacob says, no, this is the way I intend to do it. And he gave the greater blessing to Ephraim, the younger of Joseph's two sons. So there's this, there's a history, right, in all of this. It's not always playing out the way that tradition would have said for the older to always get that first and greatest blessing.
We also have with the prodigal son a very similar type thing.
Mm-hmm.
Getting his blessing, and then he's coming back. Hey, I'm not worth more than a servant now.
That's true, but the Father elevated him once again. All right, so let's move on now and look at the story as it continues. So Jacob is going to be sent away. We won't take time to read all of this, but in chapter 27, the latter part, Esau is very angry. So in verse 41, Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are approaching, then I will kill my brother Jacob. So basically he's saying, as soon as Isaac my father dies, I'm going to kill Jacob. That's my next mission, is to kill Jacob. I'm going to wait for my father Isaac to die. So Rebekah learns about this, and so she tells Jacob, you've got to flee because Esau wants to kill you. And then she sort of gets, get my names right here. Rebekah gets Isaac to also send Jacob away, this time to find a wife amongst their family and not amongst the Canaanites. Again, this is Rebekah just trying to get Jacob out of the area to protect him from the very angry Esau. And so Rebekah and Isaac send Jacob away back to their homeland where their extended family lives to find a wife. And that then moves us into the second phase of his life here, Jacob the deceived, which we pick up here in chapter 28. And with this transition in stages of life for Jacob, there's also a transition event where God extends his first reinstitution of the covenant with Jacob. And so Jacob is on his way, fleeing from his home, and he has this dream of a ladder, and there are angels going up and down the ladder, and the father at the top of the ladder, and the father then speaks to Jacob. So look at chapter 28, beginning in verse 13. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, to the east, to the north, and the south. And in you shall your offspring, and in you and your offspring shall all families of the earth be blessed. So this is the first time that those promises that were made to Abraham and Isaac are now made to Jacob. And so God has, at this point, began his covenant with Jacob to carry on this series of promises. So this is a sort of a transitional period in his life, and God speaks to him with this promise. All right, this is just a quick family tree, just to reiterate how all these people are related together. And so Rebekah is related to Abraham and Isaac through similar families. And so Isaac and Rebekah send Jacob back to the family of Laban, all right, who is Rebekah's brother. And Jacob will, of course, marry the daughters of Laban, Rachel and Leah, who basically are his first cousins. All right, so chapter 29, we have the story of Jacob and Laban. And for time, I'll just sort of summarize this. Jacob reaches Haran, their sort of homeland, where Rebekah's extended family are living. He meets Rachel at a well. He's taken away by how beautiful she is. So he goes back to her father Laban, and he begins to live and work for Laban. And Laban says, you can't work for me for free. What can I do to pay you? And Jacob says, I don't want payment. I just want to marry your daughter Rachel. And so Laban says, okay, you work for me for 7 years, then I will give you Rachel to be your wife. And so Jacob works for 7 years for Laban. At the end of 7 years, he says, all right, time's up. It's time for me to marry Rachel. And so he gives Rachel to Jacob to marry, but tricks him in the process, right? Her parents aren't back here. No problem. Looking for a mom or dad, I think. Sorry, what did you say, Ray? What's that?
Has to work some more.
He has to work some more, right. So he marries who he thinks is Rachel, but then he finds out the next morning it was actually Leah instead. So Laban has pulled one over the eyes of Jacob, and Jacob now has gone from being the trickster to being the one who was tricked. And so he says, what did you do to me? Why did you do this? And Laban says, well, it's tradition. The older has to marry first. So I had to give you Leah before I could give you Rachel. And so he says, spend 1 week with Leah, and then I'll give you Rachel as your wife if you work for me for another 7 years. And so he goes ahead and marries Rachel, and then he's bound by that contract to work for 7 more years, 14 years total, there for Laban. And then the Bible says the first 7 years went by fast because he was so excited about marrying Rachel. second 7 years went by much slower there for Jacob. And then there's some conflict and turmoil between Jacob and Laban. Jacob's ready to leave. Laban doesn't want him to leave because Laban through Jacob is becoming very wealthy and prosperous. Jacob eventually and his family, they flee Laban and they return back to the land of Canaan to then meet up with Esau. And so we go from Jacob being deceived to now Jacob is distressed. He's on his way home, returned back to his mother, his brother, and he's pretty worried because he doesn't know how Esau is going to react. So he was 77 when he deceived his father. At least 14 years have gone by. So he's up there in age. He's in his 90s. And he returns back with his family and all of their flocks and their servants and etc. So it's a big group of people returning back to Canaan. All right. On his way back, though, there's another transition. All right. On his way back, he's almost back. He sends his family across the river. He stays back by himself. And we have this sort of odd story where Jacob wrestles with a man all night long. And Jacob says, I'm not going to let go until you bless me. And at this point in time, his name is changed from Jacob to Israel. And so this point in time, this transition is also marked by this interaction between Jacob and God. So we have these sort of bookends in which Jacob goes to and then returns back from his home country, leaving Canaan, going back to Canaan, and God speaks to him, God interacts with him at both of these points in time, on his way out and way back in to the land of Canaan. All right, so then he is reunited with Esau. So let's spend a few minutes looking at this account here. Beginning in chapter 32, verse 3. Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau, his brother, in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, Thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have all these possessions, and I'm going to give them to you in order that I may find favor in your sight. So he says, I'll give you all this stuff just to find favor in your sight. And the messengers come back and say, there's 400 men with Esau coming out to approach you. So Jacob is pretty worried right now that there's going to be a battle. And in verse 7, Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. So he's pretty worried about this. But it plays out, they meet back up, and Esau embraces Jacob, and Esau has forgiven his brother for all these events that took place earlier, 14 years ago, in their lives. And then we're really going to pick up at that point tomorrow, but just as a quick look ahead to complete this life of Jacob, he was distressed right here, but it played out okay with Esau. But then, as we'll see next week, he believes his favorite son Joseph has died, and so his distress gets ramped up once again with his favorite son having died, or at least he thought that was the case. So that loss of Joseph is going to really plague the life of Jacob. But then eventually, he's going to be reunited with his son Joseph, and we'll see that in the next couple of weeks. And that will complete that fourth stage of his life, where he and his family moved to Egypt with Joseph, and he spent the last few years there in Egypt, a much happier man with his whole family together once again. So, that essentially is the life of Jacob. And we'll look some more at some of these later events next few weeks. Thanks.